My name is Ashton, and I'm 34 years old. Standing face to face with my family after 2 decades feels like confronting ghosts from another lifetime. The day they split apart, Dad grabbed Mason's hand. Mom clutched Lily's, and nobody reached for mine. I became invisible that afternoon. The forgotten middle child abandoned to state care, while they built separate lives without me. Now they want back in, acting like I should be grateful. But how do you welcome people who walked away when you needed them most? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to rebuild yourself after being left behind. Trust me, this story will show you that family isn't always who shares your blood. Before everything fell apart, we were just another middle-class family in suburban Boston. On the surface, the 5 of us seemed normal enough. My dad, Richard, worked in finance, climbing the corporate ladder with relentless determination. He wore tailored suits, spoke with authority, and commanded respect the moment he entered a room. His ambition was admirable, but his temper was legendary. When deals went south, the whole house felt the aftershocks. Mom, Sophia, taught 4th grade at the local elementary school. She had this way of making everything feel warm and safe, at least when Dad wasn't around. Her smile could light up a room, but I noticed it appearing less frequently as the years passed. Behind her gentle demeanor, frustration simmered about sacrifices made for Dad's career and dreams she'd postponed. My brother Mason was 2 years older than me. He was the golden child, smart, athletic, and blessed with natural talent for the violin that made him the star of every school concert. Dad saw himself in Mason, grooming him as his successor from an early age. They'd spend Saturdays at baseball games or fishing, bonding over competitions and achievements. Mason wasn't arrogant about being the favorite, but he never had to wonder if he mattered. Then there was Lily, my sister, 3 years younger than me. With her bright eyes and infectious laugh, she had Mom wrapped around her little finger from day one. Despite being the baby of the family, she had a fierce streak that surprised everyone. Mom channeled all her nurturing energy into Lily, teaching her to be both strong and feminine, in ways Mom perhaps wished she'd been. And me, I was the middle child, the buffer between opposing forces. Not brilliant like Mason, or adorable like Lily. I existed in the negative space between their spotlights. I wasn't bad at anything particular, but neither was I exceptional enough to command attention. My report cards were good, but not frame-worthy. My Little League performance was adequate, but not scout-worthy. I was dependable, invisible Ashton. Sometimes I wonder if I would have eventually found my place if things had stayed intact. Maybe I was just a late bloomer waiting for my moment to shine. But that possibility evaporated the summer I turned 10. We did have some beautiful moments together before everything unraveled. The summer vacation at Cape Cod when I was 7 stands out in my memory. For one glorious week, we were the family from the photographs, building sandcastles, collecting seashells, and watching sunsets with ice cream dripping down our wrists. Dad didn't check his phone constantly, and Mom laughed without restraint. My 8th birthday was another rare highlight. Mom baked my favorite chocolate cake with peanut butter frosting, and Dad took the entire day off work. He gave me my first bike, midnight blue, with silver handlebars. I can still feel his hand on my back as he ran alongside, keeping me steady until I found my balance. Mason didn't even complain about having to join in the celebration of his ordinary brother, and Lily made me a card with crayon stick figures of our family holding hands. Those memories feel like they belong to someone else, now snapshots from a life I was evicted from, because beneath those picture-perfect moments, fault lines were forming. The arguments started small, disagreements about Bill's parenting approaches or social obligations. Mom wanted to stay near her family. Dad chased promotions in other cities. Mom believed in encouragement. Dad pushed for excellence through criticism. These conflicts played out in hushed, tense conversations after we went to bed, but children absorb more than adults realize. By the time I was 9, the pretense of unity was wearing thin. Dad started working later, sometimes not coming home until after we were asleep. Mom joined a book club that met suspiciously often, and left her with wine-stained lips and red-rimmed eyes. Family dinners became battlegrounds of passive-aggressive comments and pointed silences. Mason retreated into his schoolwork and music, practicing violin, until his fingers blistered, perhaps hoping his achievements could somehow restore harmony. Lily clung to Mom like a lifeline, developing an almost pathological fear of being left alone. And I became the family peacekeeper, developing an intuitive sense for when to crack a joke, when to change the subject, or when to create a minor crisis that would temporarily unite my parents in shared concern. I didn't understand the adult complexities at play, the financial pressures, the emotional disconnection, the diverging life goals. I just knew the air in our house felt heavier, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm charged with unspoken tension and inevitable destruction. One night, about 6 months before everything imploded, I found Mom crying at the kitchen table after midnight. When I asked what was wrong, she pulled me against her chest and whispered, "Sometimes people can love each other, but still make each other miserable, Ash. Remember that when you grow up." I didn't know what she meant then. I wish I'd never had to learn. During those final months, I started having stomach aches before school and trouble sleeping. My teacher sent a note home about my increased withdrawal in class. But, with Mason winning the regional violin competition and Lily developing mysterious asthma attacks that seemed to coincide with parental arguments, my quiet suffering went largely unnoticed. Looking back with adult eyes, I can see now that we weren't just a family drifting apart. We were a collision course of incompatible dreams and unmet needs, with 3 children caught in the wreckage. And as the most forgettable passenger on that sinking ship, I should have known I'd be the one left without a lifeboat. The arguments between my parents escalated like a disease, progressing through stages. What once happened behind closed doors now erupted at dinner tables and during weekend outings. Money became a constant source of tension. Dad making it Mom, spending it neither, agreeing on priorities. "We need to save for the kids' college?" Dad would insist, slamming cabinet doors. "They need a present, not just a future." Mom would counter, eyes flashing with resentment at the implication she was irresponsible. Their careers became another battleground. Dad received a promotion opportunity in Chicago that would require relocation. Mom refused to uproot her classroom of students mid-year or abandon her aging parents in Massachusetts. The standoff lasted months, with Dad commuting weekly and returning with increasing resentment. They fought about how to raise us too. Dad thought Mason needed tougher coaching to truly excel at violin, pushing for stricter practice schedules and more competitive programs. Mom believed in nurturing his natural joy in music. When it came to Lily, Dad worried Mom was making her too dependent, while Mom accused Dad of being emotionally unavailable. As for me, they rarely disagreed about my upbringing, perhaps because neither had strong opinions about it. Our home transformed from a sanctuary to a minefield. Dad and Mom began living like uncomfortable roommates, coordinating schedules to minimize contact. Breakfast became a silent affair, with Dad hidden behind his newspaper, Mom preparing lunches with tight-lipped efficiency. They stopped touching, stopped laughing, stopped using each other's names, referring to each other as your father or your mother when speaking to us kids. I was 10 years old, confused but perceptive enough to sense the wrongness permeating our house. I started having nightmares about being left alone in empty rooms, waking up drenched in sweat that felt prophetic. Then came the day that divided my life into before and after. It was a Saturday morning in April. The weather couldn't decide whether to embrace spring or cling to winter, much like our family. Couldn't decide whether to fight for connection or surrender to division. I remember the gray clouds and hesitant sunshine creating strange shadows on our living room floor. Mason was upstairs practicing violin. Lily was coloring at the coffee table. I was building a model airplane, following the intricate instructions with careful precision, taking pride in doing something right when everything around me felt wrong. The argument started in the kitchen, voices initially controlled but rapidly escalating. I couldn't make out all the words, but certain phrases cut through with painful clarity. "I can't do this anymore, Sophia. You've never been fully present anyway, Richard. This isn't working. It hasn't been working for years. Then go. Just go if that's what you want." The kitchen door swung open. Dad stormed into the living room, face flushed with anger and something else. Determination, perhaps, or relief at finally voicing the unspeakable. "I'm leaving," he announced, his voice strangely calm. "This marriage is over." Mom followed, tears streaming down her face, but her stance defiant. "Fine. We'll be better off without you." Lily dropped her crayon, her small face crumpling in confusion. I accidentally snapped the wing off my airplane, but couldn't look away from the scene unfolding. Then Dad looked upstairs and called Mason, "Pack a bag. You're coming with me." The violin music stopped abruptly. Mason appeared at the top of the stairs, his expression a mixture of shock and fear. Mom's eyes widened. What number? You can't take him. I'm his father. He needs a man's guidance. He's coming with me to Chicago. You can't just take my son. Our son. And yes, I can. We both know the courts will side with me. Stable income corporate housing provided private school opportunities. The color drained from Mom's face. She turned to Lily, who had started crying silently. Lily, sweetheart, go pack your favorite clothes. We're going to Grandma's house. You're taking Lily? Dad's voice held genuine surprise. Of course I am. You think I'd leave my daughter? They faced each other like opponents in a chess game, each claiming a child piece from the board. Mason reluctantly descended the stairs, confusion evident in his hesitant movements. And I sat there, the forgotten pawn, waiting for someone to claim me, to include me in their plans. The silence stretched as neither parent looked in my direction or spoke my name. What about Ashton? Mason finally asked, his voice small, but startling in the tense atmosphere. My parents exchanged a glance that conveyed volumes of unspoken complications. Dad cleared his throat. Ashton. Well. Mom interjected. Your father's apartment won't have room for 2 boys. And your mother's parents' house is already crowded. Dad added quickly. I remember feeling like I was watching this unfold from somewhere outside my body. The realization that neither parent wanted to take me hit with physical force, like being punched in the stomach. Neither had automatically reached for me the way Dad had claimed Mason and Mom had clutched Lily. So where am I supposed to go? My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, higher and more fragile than I'd intended. Another uncomfortable exchange of glances between my parents. We'll figure something out temporarily, Dad muttered, not meeting my eyes. Maybe you could stay with the Petersons next door for a few days, Mom suggested, her tone falsely bright. Until we get settled. Temporary. A few days. The vagueness of their plans for me contrasted sharply with the decisive actions they were taking for my siblings. I wasn't even worth a concrete plan. What followed was a blur of hasty packing and tense movements. Dad helped Mason gather his things, including his precious violin. Mom rushed Lily upstairs to fill her pink suitcase with clothes and stuffed animals. I sat motionless on the living room floor, surrounded by the pieces of my broken model airplane, unable to process what was happening. Should I pack? Where would I go? How long was temporary? When the time came to leave, the scene branded itself into my memory with cruel clarity. Dad standing by his packed car, hand on Mason's shoulder. Mom clutching Lily's hand, their matching floral suitcases, waiting to be loaded into her sedan. And me standing in the doorway, belongings still unpacked, future unplanned. Mason looked back at me, his eyes filled with confusion and guilt. I'll call you, he promised, but Dad was already ushering him into the passenger seat. Lily broke free from Mom and ran to hug me fiercely. Don't worry, Ashton. Mommy says this won't be forever. Mom gently pulled her away, avoiding my gaze. They drove off in opposite directions, leaving me alone in a house, suddenly too large and too quiet. Mrs. Peterson from next door found me sitting on the front steps 3 hours later, as the spring chill settled into evening. She brought me inside for dinner, her face pinched with concern, and made phone calls I didn't understand the significance of until men and women with clipboards arrived the following morning. That was how I entered the foster care system, not with careful planning or tearful goodbyes, but through abandonment so complete that even our neighbors recognized it before my parents did. The transition from being a forgotten middle child to a ward of the state happened with disorienting speed. Within 24 hours of my parents' departure, I found myself sitting in a sterile office answering questions from a woman named Janet, who called herself my caseworker. Her voice was kind, but clinical, as she asked about my home life, my relationship with my parents, whether I'd ever experienced abuse or neglect. Not abuse. I remember telling her, just invisibility. She looked up from her clipboard, then really seeing me for perhaps the first time, and I witnessed that flicker of pity that would become all too familiar in the years ahead. The first night in the emergency shelter remains one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. The building itself wasn't frightening, just an ordinary converted house, with bunk beds and communal spaces. But the reality of my situation hit me with full force as I lay in an unfamiliar bed, surrounded by the breathing of stranger children with their own sad stories. I learned new vocabulary in those early days: the System Placement Family Reunification Plan Dependency Court. Adults spoke these words around me, as if I couldn't hear or couldn't understand. I became fluent in a language no child should have to learn. My court-appointed lawyer, Mr. Reynolds, explained my legal situation with awkward simplicity. My parents hadn't technically abandoned me. They'd left me with a neighbor after all, but neither had made concrete arrangements for my care. The state was stepping in temporarily until my parents sorted out custody arrangements. Temporarily, I repeated, clinging to the word like a life raft. Mr. Reynolds' sad smile told me everything his words wouldn't. After 2 weeks in the emergency shelter, I was placed with my first foster family, the Harrises. Sandra and Mike, a middle-aged couple whose own children had recently left for college. They were decent people who provided clean clothes, regular meals, and a quiet bedroom with blue walls. Sandra helped me with homework and made sure I had lunch money. Mike took me fishing once and to a Red Sox game. But there was a distance they couldn't seem to bridge, or perhaps didn't try to. I was a responsibility, not a son. A temporary placement, not family. I lived in their house for 4 months, and they never once asked about my favorite foods, or what books I enjoyed, or whether I had dreams for the future. My parents called separately, their conversations awkward and brief. Dad talked about Chicago and how Mason was adjusting to his new school and violin teacher. Mom described Grandma's house and how Lily was making friends in the neighborhood. Neither mentioned when they might come for me or what the long-term plan was. The calls became less frequent, then stopped almost entirely. After the Harrises, I was moved to Mrs. Barbara Fleming's home, a place that quickly taught me not all foster parents had even basic good intentions. Barbara was in her 60s, a widow who fostered children less for their welfare and more for the stipend that supplemented her Social Security. The refrigerator had a padlock. The bathroom had a timer on the shower. Every possession was monitored, every privilege contingent on complete obedience. There were 3 other foster kids at Barbara's, Tony, Marcus, and Jenna. We formed an uneasy alliance against her petty tyrannies, covering for each other's mistakes and sharing hoarded snacks after bedtime. I stayed there for 7 miserable months, during which I received exactly 1 phone call from my mother on my birthday, and none from my father. School became another battleground. Being the foster kid marked me as different, an easy target. My clothes came from donation bins, my school supplies from charity drives. I learned to keep my head down to become even more invisible than I'd been, in my own family. I switched schools 3 times in 2 years. As I moved between placements, always the new kid, always behind on curriculum, always struggling to find my footing. I started building walls around myself. Don't get attached to anyone. Don't unpack completely. Don't believe promises. Don't expect consistency. These became my mantras, my survival strategies. I watched other foster kids cycle through the homes where I stayed, some returning to rehabilitated parents, others finding adoptive families. The unluckiest aging out of the system with nothing but a garbage bag of possessions and minimal life skills. By 13, I had lived in 4 different foster homes and attended 5 different schools. I had no contact with Mason or Lily. Dad called twice a year at most, the conversations growing more strained as we became strangers to each other. Mom sent occasional cards with $20 bills, but no return address. My caseworker had changed 3 times, each new person needing to be brought up to speed on my situation. The system wasn't cruel exactly, just overburdened and impersonal. Most of the social workers genuinely cared, but carried caseloads of 30 or 40 children each with complex needs and limited resources. Foster parents ranged from saints to monsters, with most falling somewhere in the benignly inadequate middle. I wasn't beaten or starved, just progressively overlooked and institutionalized. I learned to navigate this strange limbo existence. I discovered that being helpful, but not needy, pleasant, but not attention-seeking, was the optimal strategy for foster care survival. I became adept at reading the moods of adults, at anticipating needs, before they were voiced at making myself useful without being intrusive. These skills would serve me well later in life, but the cost of acquiring them was steep. The most difficult part wasn't the practical hardships, the moving, the changing schools, the unfamiliar houses. It was the existential wound of knowing I was unwanted, unworthy of being fought for. While my siblings remained firmly attached to a parent, I floated through a system where everyone was paid to care for me. The question that haunted me through those years was simple and devastating. What was so fundamentally wrong with me that both parents could leave me behind? I built a fortress around my heart, brick by brick, year by year. I learned to expect nothing to need. No one to find security, only in my own capabilities. I developed a particular kind of self-reliance that looked like strength, but was born of abandonment. By the time I turned 13, I had mastered the art of emotional solitude, of being present but unattached in every relationship and situation. I never allowed myself to imagine a different future. Foster care became my reality, temporary placements, my version of normal. I stopped flinching when kids at school asked where my parents were. I stopped hoping for phone calls or visits. I stopped expecting to matter to anyone. And then the Johnsons happened. I arrived at the Johnsons' modest 2-story home on a rainy Tuesday in October, 1 month after my 13th birthday. My social worker, Tanya, the fourth in 3 years, had warned me not to get too comfortable. The Johnsons are good people, but they've never fostered a teenager before. They usually take younger kids. I nodded, already mentally unpacking as little as possible. Another temporary stop, another family to observe, but not join. David Johnson opened the door before we reached it. His tall frame filled the doorway, but his smile created an immediate impression of gentleness. Salt and pepper beard glasses perched on his nose, paint-stained jeans. He looked more like a college professor than the construction manager Tanya had described. "You must be Ashton," he said, extending his hand to me, not to Tanya, a small distinction that registered immediately. "Welcome to our chaos." Behind him, Martha Johnson appeared, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. She was shorter than her husband, with curly brown hair and laugh lines around her eyes. "Don't let him scare you with that chaos talk. We're just normal-level messy, not hoarder-level messy." Her smile reached her eyes, another detail I noted automatically. The house smelled of baking cookies and wood, not air freshener or disinfectant like Barbara Fleming's place, or the faint mustiness of the Harris's rarely used formal living room. This home smelled lived-in, active present. "Ryan's upstairs finishing homework," Martha explained, as she showed me to my room. "He's 15, so you two might have some things in common." The bedroom wasn't large, but contained thoughtful touches. A desk by the window, bookshelves with actual books. A bulletin board empty, except for a small welcome note and a bedspread that wasn't the standard issue foster care. Variety, but something chosen with actual consideration. Blue with constellations that I would later learn glowed faintly in the dark. "We didn't know what you'd like," David admitted, setting my single duffel bag on the bed, "so we kept it pretty neutral. But you can change anything. Posters, paint color, eventually whatever makes it feel like your space." My space. The concept was so foreign I couldn't immediately process it. At dinner, I met Ryan, their biological son, lanky, with his father's height and his mother's curls. He regarded me with open curiosity rather than the wariness or pity I typically encountered. "Dad says you're from Boston originally. Hate to break it to you, but we're Yankees fans in this house." I waited for the parental reprimand, the reminder to be sensitive about my situation. Instead, David snorted, and Martha rolled her eyes fondly. "What Ryan means to say is welcome, and we respect your misguided baseball affiliations," Martha corrected with a wink. Something in my chest loosened a fraction. They weren't handling me like fragile glass or a potential problem. They were just including me. Those first weeks with the Johnsons, I maintained my careful distance. I helped with dishes without being asked, kept my room spotless, spoke only when spoken to, and prepared for the inevitable moment when they would realize fostering a teenager was too much trouble. But the Johnsons operated differently from any foster family I'd encountered. David, I discovered, was indeed a construction manager by day, but his passion was woodworking. His workshop in the garage became a sanctuary where he invited me to observe, then assist, then eventually create alongside him. Everyone should know how to build something with their hands, he told me one Saturday as he guided me through shaping a simple wooden box. Gives you perspective on what you're capable of. Martha worked as a nurse at the local hospital, her schedule often irregular, but her presence consistent in the ways that mattered. Unlike other foster parents who maintained their distance, she asked questions and genuinely listened to my answers, building a mental catalog of my preferences and habits without making it feel like an interrogation. You don't have to eat the crusts if you don't want to, she noted casually, after watching me methodically trim them from my toast for several mornings. The next day my breakfast appeared with the crusts already removed, a tiny gesture that nearly undid me with its attentiveness. Ryan became the first real friend I'd had since entering foster care. Initially wary of each other, we discovered shared interests in science fiction and computer games. He introduced me to his friends without explanation or apology, simply presenting me as Ashton, who lives with us now. When someone at school made a foster kid joke within his hearing, Ryan's defense was immediate and fierce. He's not just some foster kid I overheard him telling a classmate. He's living with us, period. The Johnsons didn't push for emotional disclosure, didn't force family game nights or group therapy sessions. Instead, they created space for me to exist comfortably, to unfurl slowly at my own pace. David taught me carpentry on Saturdays, but was equally content if I chose to read instead. Martha invited me to help with cooking, but never made it an obligation. Ryan included me in his activities, but respected when I needed solitude. Gradually, cautiously, I began to thaw. I volunteered information about my day at dinner. I left my bedroom door open sometimes. I stopped tensing when Martha ruffled my hair in passing, or when David clapped my shoulder after I completed a woodworking project successfully. School performance, which had suffered through years of disruption, began to stabilize. The Johnsons hired a tutor to help me catch up in math, my weakest subject. Martha contacted my teachers regularly, not to check if I was causing problems, but to understand how to support my learning. For the first time since entering foster care, I received report cards worth displaying on the refrigerator. During this period, I discovered an affinity for computers. The Johnsons had an aging desktop that Ryan primarily used for games, but I found myself drawn to understanding how it worked. When I expressed interest, David bought a used programming book from a second-hand store. Hours spent decoding its mysteries became my favorite pastime. The logical problems and solutions, a comfort in their predictability. The truly transformative moment came 8 months into my stay with the Johnsons. After a particularly difficult therapy session where I'd finally discussed some of the abandonment feelings I'd suppressed for years, I returned to the house emotionally raw and exhausted. Martha took one look at my face and simply opened her arms. For the first time since entering foster care, I accepted the embrace without reservation, allowing myself to be held like the child I still was. I cried against her shoulder, years of carefully contained grief finally finding release. Later that evening, helping David in the workshop I hesitantly referred to when I have to leave while discussing a long-term project. David set down his tools and faced me directly. Ashton, we've been meaning to talk to you about that. If you're comfortable here, if this feels like somewhere you might want to stay, Martha and I have been discussing adoption. The word hung in the air between us simultaneously, terrifying and exhilarating. But my parents, I stammered, not even sure what I meant to say. They existed in some nebulous state, not actively parenting me but still legally connected occasionally, making contact but never following through. Your parents' rights haven't been terminated, David acknowledged. But it's been 3 years, with minimal contact and no progress toward reunification. Your caseworker believes a petition for termination of parental rights could be successful if that's a path you might want to explore. Want. My desires had rarely factored into my journey through foster care. Things happened to me, decisions were made about me. The idea that I might have agency in determining my future family was revolutionary. You don't need to decide anything now, Martha assured me later. This is your life, Ashton. We want you to be part of our family, but only if that's what you want too. That night alone, in my room, the room that could potentially become permanently mine, I faced the terrifying possibility of belonging somewhere. The fortress I'd built around my heart had kept me safe from disappointment, but had also prevented connection. Dismantling it would require tremendous courage. What if I allowed myself to hope to attach, only to be abandoned again? What if the Johnsons changed their minds? What if my parents suddenly reappeared, wanting me back after all these years of absence? But looking around the room, at the woodworking projects displayed on shelves, the computer books stacked on the desk, the bulletin board now filled with school announcements and photographs of hiking trips with Ryan, I recognized that something had already changed. Without intending to, I had begun to put down roots. The next morning at breakfast, I took the most significant emotional risk of my young life. "I'd like to stay," I told the Johnsons softly. "If you're sure." The joy that spread across their faces contained no reservation, no calculation of benefit or burden. It was pure acceptance, the first I'd experienced since my family fractured. "We're sure," David said simply. "Told you he'd say yes." Ryan mumbled through a mouthful of cereal, but his pleased expression betrayed his own enthusiasm. Martha reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "We'll start the paperwork today." For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future beyond survival, beyond temporary placements and careful emotional distance. I permitted myself tentatively to use the word family in my mind when thinking about the Johnsons. It would take time for the legal process to unfold. There would be hurdles and complications. But, sitting at that breakfast table, I felt something fragile and precious beginning to take root. A sense of belonging that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with choice. The letter from Mason arrived 3 days after my 16th birthday, forwarded through my social worker, since he had no direct address for me. The envelope bore a Chicago postmark and contained 3 pages of cramped handwriting that I read and reread until the paper grew soft at the folds. "Dear Ashton, it began formality highlighting our estrangement. It's taken me a long time to find you. Dad wouldn't tell me how to contact you, and Mom claimed not to know where you were exactly. Mason was 18 now, preparing for college applications and wrestling with the past in ways I recognized intimately. His letter painted a picture of the life I'd missed: Dad's corporate success in Chicago, followed by 2 failed marriages, constant relocations, as Dad chased promotions, the gradual disintegration of their father-son relationship. He wasn't the father I thought he'd be," Mason wrote. "After a year, he got busy with work again and started leaving me with babysitters, then eventually sent me to live with grandmother in Milwaukee when I was 14. I think he realized taking me was more about hurting Mom than wanting me. The revelation should have been vindictively satisfying. My golden boy brother also ultimately discarded. Instead, it deepened the ache of our shared abandonment. Most surprising was Mason's expressed desire to reconnect. "I know it's probably too little too late, but I've never stopped thinking about you, Ash. That day haunts me. I should have refused to go without you." David and Martha supported my decision to meet Mason at a cafe halfway between our homes, though their protective concern was evident in the way David insisted on driving me and waiting nearby. "Whatever happens, you have a home to come back to," Martha reminded me as I left. 6 years had transformed Mason from the boy I remembered into a stranger with familiar eyes. Taller, leaner, his violin calluses replaced by guitarist's calluses. He stood awkwardly when I entered the cafe, uncertainty replacing the confidence I associated with him. "You look good," he offered, the inadequacy of the statement hanging between us. "So do you." I remained standing, not ready to commit to the implied intimacy of sitting together. The conversation that followed was stilted, punctuated by painful silences and careful navigations around emotional landmines. Mason described his life with Dad, the initial excitement of Chicago giving way to loneliness as Dad worked 60-hour weeks and dated increasingly younger women. The broken promises. The gradual realization that he had been a pawn in a marital power struggle rather than a treasured son. "He talks about you sometimes," Mason admitted, stirring his untouched coffee. "Usually when he's been drinking. Says he made a mistake, that he should have found a way to keep both of us. But he never tried to find me." The statement emerged flatter than I'd intended, stripped of the accusation it warranted. No, Mason acknowledged meeting my eyes directly for the first time. He didn't. And neither did I, not really, not until recently. I don't expect forgiveness for that, Ash. I just wanted you to know I never forgot you. I maintained my emotional barricades throughout the meeting, observing my brother with clinical detachment. This person shared my blood but was essentially a stranger connected by memories that now felt like scenes from a movie I'd watched long ago. We parted with an awkward handshake that transformed into a brief one-armed hug. "I'd like to keep in touch," Mason said. "If that's okay." "I'll think about it," I replied, unwilling to commit even to this small reconnection. Driving home with David, I processed the encounter in silence, surprised by my own emotional numbness. I had expected rage or grief or some cathartic release. Instead, I felt oddly empty, as if meeting Mason had confirmed what I'd long suspected. The brother I'd lost existed only in memory. This new person, with his guilty conscience and tentative overtures, was just another adult with complicated motives. Before I could fully process the Mason situation, my mother resurfaced through official channels, contacting my social worker to arrange a meeting. Unlike Mason's hesitant approach, Mom's was characterized by an assumed right to access, as if our relationship had merely been paused rather than severed. "You don't have to see her," my caseworker assured me. "At your age, you have input into visitation decisions." But curiosity, that dangerous companion to abandoned children, compelled me to agree. Martha offered to accompany me for support, but this was a journey I needed to make alone, armed with the emotional resilience the Johnsons had helped me develop. The family court building provided neutral territory for our reunion. Mom arrived with Lily in tow, both dressed as if for church, in coordinated outfits that spoke of financial comfort. Mom had aged in ways that surprised me, hair expertly colored to hide gray fine lines around her eyes, a polished veneer that hadn't existed in my memories. "Ashton." She stepped forward, arms outstretched, then faltered when I didn't reciprocate the gesture. "You've grown so much." Lily, now 13, hung back, studying me with the wary curiosity reserved for mythical figures made real. In her features, I could see echoes of the small girl who had hugged me fiercely that last day, but her mannerisms were those of a stranger. "Hi," she offered softly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation Mom had dragged her into. The supervised visitation room, with its institutional furniture and observation window, heightened the artificiality of our interaction. Mom dominated the conversation, filling silence with constant narrative about her life remarriage to an accountant named George, their lovely home in Connecticut, Lily's achievements in swimming and debate club. The subtext was clear. They had thrived without me. "I've thought about you every day," Mom insisted, her hand reaching across the table to touch mine. I withdrew subtly, maintaining physical boundaries. "I never wanted to leave you behind." "But you did," I stated simply. No accusation, just fact. "The circumstances were impossible," she countered, defensive edge, sharpening her voice. "Your father gave me no choice. I couldn't take both children. My parents' house barely had room for Lily and me. I thought it would be temporary, just until I got settled." 6 years is a long temporary, I observed. Mom's eyes glistened with tears that might have been genuine. "I know, and I can never make that up to you. But things are different now. George and I have plenty of space. You could have your own room, a fresh start. You could get to know your sister again." Lily looked up at this surprise, suggesting this possibility hadn't been discussed with her beforehand. "I have a home," I said quietly. "The Johnsons are adopting me." The news landed like a physical blow. Mom's composure cracked, revealing something raw beneath. Perhaps genuine grief. Perhaps just the narcissistic injury of being replaced. "But we're your family," she protested. "Your real family." The statement ignited something in me. Not the rage I'd anticipated, but a clarity that felt like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. "Biology doesn't make a family," I told her evenly. "Presence does. Choice does. The Johnsons chose me when no one else did. They show up every day, not just when it's convenient." Mom began crying in earnest, then the carefully applied makeup tracking down her cheeks. Lily watched with wide eyes, witnessing a side of her mother she perhaps rarely saw. "I'm sorry," Mom said between sobs. "I know I failed you. But please don't shut us out completely. Give us a chance to know you again." I studied my mother and sister, these genetic connections. who felt less familiar to me than David teaching me to sand wood or Martha singing off-key while making pancakes. They had continued their lives, while mine had fractured and reformed into something entirely different. "I'm not the same person you left behind." I told them, the words emerging with surprising gentleness. "That child doesn't exist anymore. If you want to know who I am now, we'd have to start from scratch." The meeting ended with tentative plans for limited contact. Occasional letters, perhaps supervised visits if I felt comfortable. As we parted, Lily suddenly broke protocol and hugged me, a quick, fierce embrace reminiscent of our last goodbye. "I missed having a brother," she whispered before Mom pulled her away. Driving home with my caseworker, I felt a strange lightness. The confrontations I'd feared for years had finally occurred, and I had survived them intact. The power dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the abandoned child desperate for explanation or acceptance. I was the one setting boundaries, making choices, determining the shape of these relationships moving forward. That evening, sitting with the Johnsons on their back deck, watching fireflies emerge in the summer twilight, I shared selective details of both encounters. They listened without interruption, offering support through their steady presence rather than platitudes. "What do you think you'll do?" David finally asked. "About staying in touch with them?" I considered the question carefully. "I don't know yet. But for the first time, it feels like my decision. Not something happening to me, but something I get to choose." Martha nodded, understanding the significance. "That's how it should be." Ryan, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "For what it's worth, I think you're handling this way better than most people would. I'd probably be throwing chairs or something." The mental image broke the solemnity, and I found myself laughing, a genuine, unburdened sound that surprised me with its freedom. In that moment, surrounded by chosen family under an emerging blanket of stars, I understood that healing doesn't always arrive in dramatic epiphanies. Sometimes it comes in quiet moments of clarity, in the simple recognition that you're no longer defined by what was taken from you, but by what you've built from the wreckage. The adoption became official 3 months after my 17th birthday, following lengthy legal proceedings to terminate my parents' rights. The judge, a stern-faced woman with unexpectedly kind eyes, asked if I wanted to change my last name to Johnson. "Yes," I answered, without hesitation. Ashton Johnson. A new identity to match my new beginning. David squeezed my shoulder as the gavel fell, finalizing what our hearts had known for months. We were family not by blood, but by choice. Martha couldn't stop crying happy tears. Ryan performed an exaggerated bow, announcing, "I officially accept the burden of permanent brotherhood." The certificate framed in our living room marked a legal endpoint to my time in foster care. But the psychological journey of becoming someone's son again, truly securely, and continued daily, in small moments of trust, connection. Senior year of high school brought college applications and future planning activities my peers took for granted, but which felt miraculous to me. Martha helped me research scholarships for foster youth and adoptees. David drove me to campus tours, patiently discussing the pros and cons of each school on the long drives home. "Whatever you decide, we're behind you," he assured me repeatedly. "This is your home, no matter where you study." I graduated with honors, my turnaround in academic performance, drawing attention from several universities. The Johnsons hosted a backyard celebration where I was surrounded by their extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins who had embraced me as one of their own, without qualification or asterisk. Ryan, home from his freshman year at college, raised a toast that left few dry eyes. "To my brother," he said simply, "who taught me more about strength than anyone I've ever known." That summer brought another unexpected development: contact from my father after nearly 9 years of silence. Unlike Mason's tentative letter, or my mother's emotional appeals, Dad's approach was characteristically direct, a phone call to the Johnsons' home, as if he'd merely been delayed rather than absent for nearly a decade. "Ashton," his voice sounded older, rougher than I remembered. "It's your father." I almost corrected him. David was my father now in every way that mattered, but held my tongue, curious about his purpose. "I'm in town for a business conference," he continued, filling my silence. "I thought we might meet for dinner." The meeting occurred at an upscale restaurant near his hotel, the kind of establishment where servers wore ties and wine lists resembled novels. Dad had aged considerably, hair more salt than pepper, stress lines etched deeply around his mouth. But the expensive suit and commanding presence remained unchanged. "You look well," he offered, appraising me with what seemed like genuine surprise, as if he'd expected the system to have broken me visibly. "I am well," I confirmed simply. The conversation that followed revealed a pattern similar to what Mason had described. Dad's life had progressed through professional successes and personal failures. 3 marriages, the most recent ending in another expensive divorce. Estrangement from Mason, who had chosen music over the business path Dad had planned. Financial setbacks that had humbled but not fundamentally changed him. "I made mistakes," he acknowledged over dessert he barely touched. "With your mother. With you kids. Especially with you, Ashton. I should have found a way to keep you with me." The apology sounded rehearsed, lacking the emotional weight such admissions should carry. I wondered if he'd practiced it in his hotel room mirror. "Why now?" I asked directly. "Why reach out after all this time?" Dad shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his tie. "I'm getting older, starting to think about legacy, about family. Mason barely speaks to me. I thought maybe with you, we could start fresh." Further conversation revealed the probable catalyst. Dad had suffered a minor heart attack 6 months earlier, confronting his mortality for perhaps the first time. But beneath his overtures of reconciliation, I detected another motivation when he mentioned his recent financial reverses and asked pointed questions about my college scholarships and the Johnsons' financial situation. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished," he said, reaching for sincerity, but landing closer to calculation. "Maybe I could help with college expenses." "I've received a full scholarship," I replied, not mentioning that it was specifically for former foster youth, a status I owed to his abandonment. "The Johnsons are covering the rest." Something flashed in his eyes, disappointment perhaps that I had no need for financial rescue that might have positioned him as the returning hero. The dinner concluded with vague promises to stay in touch that we both recognized as unlikely. Walking back to my car alone, I felt an unexpected lightness. The monster of my childhood memories had transformed into just a man, flawed, selfish, but ultimately ordinary in his weaknesses. The encounter had granted me a final piece of closure, confirmation that my worth had never been the issue. My parents' limitations had defined their choices, not my value. College brought new challenges and opportunities. I chose computer science as my major, building on the interest I'd developed at the Johnsons' home computer. Campus life initially overwhelmed me. The freedom, the social dynamics, the expectation of youthful exuberance, colliding with my old habit of cautious observation. But the foundation the Johnsons had provided proved solid. I made friends, gradually joined the programming club, secured an internship after sophomore year. Weekend visits home to the Johnsons recharged me when campus life became too much. Holiday gatherings with extended family anchored me in belonging. Video calls with Ryan, now studying engineering across the country, maintained our brotherly bond. Throughout these years, my biological family continued peripheral orbits around my life. Mason and I established a tentative relationship, conducted primarily through occasional emails and rare visits when our paths crossed geographically. My mother sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts, her efforts at connection, persistent but respectful of my boundaries. Lily and I developed a separate, surprisingly genuine connection through social media, discovering shared interests in photography and science fiction. Dad's communications were sporadic and usually coincided with his need for connection during personal setbacks. I maintained polite distance, neither cutting ties completely nor allowing him significant emotional access. During junior year of college, at Martha's gentle suggestion, I began seeing a therapist to process the complex emotions surrounding my biological family. Dr. Wilson helped me navigate the territory between forgiveness and self-protection, between acknowledging my parents' humanity and honoring my own experience. "Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen," she explained, during one particularly difficult session. "It means releasing the expectation that the past could have been different, so you're free to build your future." This perspective shift transformed my approach to my biological family. I could acknowledge their attempts at reconnection without obligation to provide the emotional absolution they sought. I could appreciate Mason's genuine remorse while recognizing our relationship would never resemble typical brotherhood. I could accept occasional contact with my parents, while maintaining the boundaries necessary for my well-being. Senior year brought another significant development, meeting Emma in an advanced programming class. Intelligent, direct, with a quiet confidence, I admired she intrigued me from our first project partnership. Our relationship developed cautiously on my part, my old fears of abandonment, creating hesitation that Emma met with patient understanding. When I finally shared my full history with her, expecting the pity or discomfort I'd encountered from others, Emma simply took my hand and said, "Thank you for trusting me with your story." Graduation approached with job offers from several tech companies. The Johnsons hosted a dinner to help me evaluate options. The kitchen table covered with offer letters and comparison charts Martha had meticulously prepared. Their pride in my accomplishments was evident, but more meaningful was their continued support of my autonomy. "Wherever you choose, you'll excel," David assured me, "and you'll always have a home here." As my biological and chosen families continued their complicated dance around my life, I stood at the threshold of true independence, equipped with tools for success I once couldn't have imagined possessing. The abandoned 10-year-old had become a 22-year-old man with multiple job offers, a serious relationship, and a secure attachment to a family who had chosen him. The journey hadn't been linear or simple. There were still nights when abandonment nightmares jolted me awake, days when unexpected triggers reopened old wounds. But those moments no longer defined me. They were just parts of a larger story, one that increasingly belonged to me, rather than to circumstances beyond my control. The question I faced now wasn't whether I could survive, but how I wanted to thrive. Not whether I deserved love, but how I would choose to give and receive it. Not what had been taken from me, but what I would build with the strength I'd gained through loss and recovery. As Emma and I planned our post-graduation move to Seattle for my job at a leading tech company, as the Johnsons helped furnish my first real apartment, as I navigated increasingly complex family gatherings that sometimes included biological and adoptive relatives in careful choreography, I recognized that integration, not separation, had become my path forward. The wall around my heart had not been demolished in one dramatic moment. Instead, it had been carefully disassembled, brick by brick, by the consistent love of the Johnsons, the growing trust with Emma, the professional fulfillment of work I excelled at, and my own deliberate choices to risk connection, despite its dangers. What remained was the foundation of resilience those walls had originally been built upon, not as barriers against love, but as platforms to build something new, something stronger, something chosen rather than merely survived. 20 years after the day my family fractured, I found myself hosting a gathering that once seemed impossible. My suburban home outside Seattle, filled with a complexity of family connections that defied simple explanation. The Johnsons, my real parents in every meaningful way, chatted comfortably with Emma's parents by the grill. Ryan and his wife played with my 3-year-old daughter Grace in the yard. And seated somewhat awkwardly on the patio furniture were my biological father, mother, Mason, and Lily, all present at my invitation for this milestone birthday. At 34, I had built a life that 10-year-old Ashton could never have imagined. Senior software architect at a major tech company. Husband to Emma, now a user experience director whose intuitive understanding of human needs complemented my logical approach to problem solving. Father to Grace, whose unconditional love still sometimes overwhelmed me with its simplicity. Son, brother, friend, roles I inhabited fully. No longer from behind protective walls. Watching my biological family interact with my chosen one created a strange doubling effect like overlay images in a complex design. They had all aged, Dad now fully gray and moving more slowly after a second heart attack. Mom's carefully maintained appearance showing signs of time's passage. Mason settled into early fatherhood with his own daughter, Lily finishing medical school with the determination she'd shown even as a child. My relationship with each had evolved into something unique, neither fully reconciled nor completely estranged. Dad and I maintained cordial distance, our quarterly lunches exercises in careful conversation that acknowledged the past without dwelling on it. Mom had softened with time, her previous self-justification giving way to more genuine remorse as she aged. Mason and I had developed a friendship that, while not matching typical brotherhood, contained its own authentic connection. Lily had become surprisingly close, her medical training creating common ground with Emma's scientific mind. The path to this gathering had not been linear. Years of therapy, careful boundary-setting occasional retreats when old pain resurfaced. The Johnsons' unwavering support through each reconciliation attempt and subsequent disappointment. Emma's calm presence when family dynamics triggered old insecurities. My own growing capacity to hold complexity, to understand that people could both harm and love, fail terribly, and try again. Be simultaneously unworthy of trust, yet deserving of basic compassion. After dinner, as conversations formed and reformed across the yard, I found myself alone with David Johnson beside the fire pit. Gray now dominated his beard, and retirement had softened his carpenter's hands, but his steady presence remained unchanged. Quite a scene he observed, nodding toward where Martha was showing Grace how to make a daisy chain, my biological mother, watching with wistful attention. Younger, you would have never believed this possible. Younger me would have run screaming into the night, I acknowledged with a small smile. David's laugh held understanding without judgment. You've built something remarkable here, Ash. Not just the career or the family, but this capacity to integrate all these pieces of your life without being destroyed by the contradictions. His observation touched something fundamental. The journey from abandoned child to whole adult hadn't been about forgetting or even necessarily forgiving in the conventional sense. It had been about integration, about finding a way to incorporate all aspects of my experience into a coherent narrative that belonged to me rather than to those who had shaped it. Later that evening, after everyone had departed, except the Johnsons who were staying in our guest room, I sat on the back porch with Emma watching the stars emerge. Was it okay? She asked, her hand finding mine in comfortable familiarity, having everyone here. I considered the question carefully. It was. Right, I finally answered. Not perfect or easy, but right. Like closing a circle that's been open for decades. The profound lesson of my journey had crystallized gradually over years of healing. Abandonment had shaped me, but did not define me. The people who left had contributed to who I became, but so had those who stayed. The Johnsons with their unwavering commitment, Emma with her patient love, and ultimately myself, with each choice to remain open despite the risk of further pain. True healing hadn't come from confronting my parents with their failures or extracting apologies, satisfying as those moments sometimes were. It hadn't come from cutting ties completely or pretending the past didn't matter. It had emerged from the harder, messier path of building a life so solid that the past lost its power to threaten my present. I had learned that forgiveness isn't necessarily a gift you give someone else. Sometimes it's a gift you give yourself, permission to stop carrying the weight of others' failures. I had discovered that family could be both born and made, that belonging could be both inherited and created, that love could be both broken and rebuilt. Most importantly, I had found that the abandoned child doesn't disappear when you grow up. He becomes integrated into the adult you become. His vulnerability transformed into compassion, his survival skills into resilience, his longing for connection into appreciation for chosen family. Looking back at the house where Grace slept peacefully under Martha's watchful eye, where David relaxed in a home my own hands had helped build, where photographs of biological and chosen family shared wall space without contradiction, I recognized the completion of a journey I'd never expected to survive, let alone transcend. You know, Emma said softly, following my gaze. Grace will never know what it's like to be unwanted or forgotten. That's your real triumph, breaking the cycle. In that moment, I understood that the ultimate healing comes not just from making peace with your past, but from creating a future where old wounds become sources of wisdom rather than continued pain. The abandoned child had become a father who knew exactly how precious a child's trust could be. The forgotten middle child had become a man who ensured everyone in his life felt seen and valued. The boy who once stood alone had built a circle wide enough to include even those who had once left him behind. This was the gift, hidden within the wound, the strength forged through brokenness, the family created from abandonment's ashes. Not perfect, not unmarked by scars, but whole. Beautifully, authentically whole. What was your experience with family growing up? Has anyone ever walked back into your life after walking away? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and healing. Remember, sometimes the family we create matters more than the one we're born into. Thank you for listening, and may you find peace with your own story, whatever shape it takes.